Hello. Ooh, that's loud. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my talk. Thank you for coming so early. I really, really appreciate it. I also don't plan to talk for like the full 50 minutes. Things might happen, I don't know. So if you want to talk at me more, well, actually, no, if you want me to talk at you more, just come find me afterwards. Cool. So before we get started, a bit of info about me. My name's Nathania, or Nat. I'm currently the lead animator at Space Rock Games. I was also recently lecturing part-time for a bit at Media Design School. I help to organise events with Auckland Makes Games, such as our monthly social and professional development meetups and our free one-day games conference, Wireframe. I'm not sure if you can see my grey hairs from back there, but I've been working in the industry since like 2016. And this year I was honoured to win the Industry Pillar Award at the PAVS, which was really nice. And my background is more in kind of like the 3D generalist and animation realm, and I've accidentally worked in VR for most of my career. I swear it was an accident. Cool. So I've worked on projects like The Green Fairy, Wanderer, Wanderer Fragments of Fate, and now I am on undisclosed NDA title at Space Rock, hopefully coming out next year. And the team at Space Rock is also working on Doomsday Diner, which is, available for wishlist now, so go find that on Steam. I really love talking about video games, probably a bit more than I like playing them, to be honest, which brings us to the school talk. Okay, so from my intro and the title of this talk, you might be asking yourself, why am I here listening to an animator tell me about critical gameplay analysis? Like, are they even qualified to be doing this? And like, not really. I'm not a game designer. I'm not a game director. I'm barely an academic. I studied a very generalist design degree over 10 years ago, and I didn't really get much in the way of like a formalized game theory or game studies education. But last semester I was helping to teach the game studies course to the first year students at MDS. And I was thinking about how useful this paper would have been for me like much earlier in my career if I had that education. So hopefully this can either serve as like a refresher course or be useful to you as it was to me. I think the great thing about critical gameplay analysis is it's something that all of us should be doing and probably already are doing, but maybe not in a conscious way. I don't think you need to be an expert to be able to understand or do this process. It's something we're all able to do, and it will help you become a better developer regardless of your discipline. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to do this talk is because of this experience that some of you might be familiar with. Okay, so picture the scenario. You head into work after a nice, relaxing weekend, ready to get back into your tasks, and someone comes in and they say, "Oh my God, I played The Last of Us Part 2 this weekend. We should totally implement a dynamic rope system exactly the way that they did for our game. Except the game that we're working on is this." And it wouldn't add anything to the game experience. Too many times I've been given notes as an animator that just mean nothing because the notes haven't been thought about holistically. If you tell someone to make a game more like another game by adding a mechanic like dynamic ropes, what do you mean? Like, how does adding dynamic ropes to Tetris Ultimate make the experience better for the player? Okay, so to kick us off, what do you think all of these games have in common? They all got 7s. They all got 7s on IGN. What does that mean? Also, nothing against IGN or their reviews. I just think it's really funny that all of these games got a 7. I think that game reviews are great and they serve a purpose, but when we're trying to dive deep into how a game or a mechanic or a system works, and we want to grab that knowledge and bring it into the game that we're playing, we need to be looking at games with a more critical and non-biased lens. We're not trying to give games an arbitrary score of, 7, good or bad. Yeah. So what is critical gameplay analysis? It's an unbiased way to play through a game and critically analyze the experience by breaking it down into sections and parts. So when I say unbiased, we're trying to stick to understanding and breaking down a game as factually as possible into its elements and trying to understand why developers have done things in a certain way. But it can be really difficult because everyone is going to have biases and their own perception and skill coming into this process, which I'll also touch on in a bit. With critical gameplay analysis, what we really want is to evaluate a game's ability to provide an intended experience to the player. We want to be able to identify strengths and weaknesses of design decisions in a game. And I think as developers, we also want to be able to take that assessment of a game that we play and apply the learnings from critically analyzing a game to our own games and the way that we work. So it's probably going to be too much information to cover in just a 50-minute session. I'll blaze through just a few of the things that we covered in the game studies paper, but it was 16 hours worth of lectures, so I will not be talking for that long. But yeah, hopefully it will cover at least a few approaches and things we can think about with games, and what we can look for and how we can apply this approach. Okay, so with this in mind, what are some of the things that we can look at when we're trying to critically analyze a game? We can ask some sort of general top-level questions and think about how to apply that to the games we work on, such as, what are the game's core mechanics? How are they built into the progression of the game? How do the mechanics work together, and is the gameplay cohesive for the player? We can ask, how is the game balanced? How does the game motivate the player? How does the game guide the player? Or you can kind of go more specific and granular with your analysis after understanding these stages. So you can ask questions like, how does the animation system work? How does the mantling system work? How does it support the aesthetics of the game? Okay, so to kick us off, what's a mechanic? I think before we get too deep into this, we kind of need to define what a mechanic is, but it can get very confusing because it can get confusing if we mix terminology up. But it's also very confusing because defining a game mechanic is very debatable on, within sort of the game theory sphere. So I think Jesse Schell, in his book, The Art of Game Design, A Book of Lenses, does a really good job of describing game mechanics, and he says that they are the core of what a game truly is. They are the interactions and relationships that remain after you strip away everything else in a game. So I guess then, mechanics can kind of be seen as verbs in games, so they can be seen as the actions that a player can take. If we look at the example of Super Mario, Mario can jump, he can run, and he can walk. Mechanics can also be rules to define how our games function. So there is a game space in Super Mario that he interacts with. He can't jump and walk wherever he likes. He can't break through certain components, like pipes, but he can break some platform types, for example. We can get a lot deeper into this, but again, it could be its own lecture in itself. So for the purposes of this talk, I think we'll probably just focus down to core mechanics. So core mechanics we can kind of define as being the repeated and core mechanics that players engage with in a game. So in Super Mario, you'd kind of say it would be running and jumping or platforming. I think it gets a lot more complex once you sort of move into the 2000s and beyond. So once you start looking at a game like any game from Rockstar, the idea of a core mechanic can get a little bit muddier. Okay. So to get us thinking a little bit deeper about mechanics and their place within games, we'll look at a few design frameworks, so don't be scared, okay? I think most of you might be familiar with the MDA framework. This is from Haneke, LeBlanc, and Zubik, and it was an academic formal approach to game design and research that was published in 2004. So they kind of posit that we can generally break down a game into rules that work together to form a system that players interact with, and the fun is the final outcome. And I guess from the game design perspective, we can see this as the designer creates the mechanics that a game operates with, which leads to dynamic outcomes. And then from that, the aesthetics, which is referring to game feel and the gameplay that the player experiences. So with this framework, when we think about the term aesthetics, we aren't actually thinking about the art going into the game, where we're actually sort of more thinking about the type of play or the tone of play that's being set by the game and how the player feels when they're playing the game. So from the game developer or the game designer side, wait, hold on, this has a laser. From this guy, from his perspective, we're viewing making games from mechanics first, which leads to the development of, the systems and outcomes, and hopefully leads to a fun game. But the player is viewing this from the opposite perspective. So they're viewing it from the aesthetics first, and mechanics is kind of a bit more obscured. I think it's important to keep this framework in mind because it helps us to think about how to break down games into parts and how every part hopefully comes together to form a holistic whole. but it doesn't really cover everything. So this isn't the only framework out there. We also have the elemental tetrad, which is again introduced by Jesse Schell, who I mentioned earlier in his book, The Art of Game Design, a Book of Lenses. And this is much more oriented towards the game developer side of thinking about games and how we break down games into parts as we're making them. So he kind of views games as being made up of 4 parts, where you have the mechanics, aesthetics, story, and technology, where story is the sort of narrative structure of the game, whether it's scripted or emergent. Technology is the medium in which the aesthetics take place and in which the mechanics will occur and through which the story will be told. So in this approach, Schell states that all 4 elements are kind of equally needed for every game, and all parts should come together to form a cohesive experience for a player. So we can also see the kind of the more visible for the player side and the less visible, which is more oriented towards, the designer. And his definition of aesthetics is more oriented towards the art, animation, and audio elements of a game, and the least visible elements being the technology, or like the code, the platform, the back end of the development that players aren't really seeing when they play the game. Okay, then we can take it another step further. And there's a design framework that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which has been proposed by Dr. Asli Tisi Barak, who is the program coordinator at Media Design School for their BSc in AI papers. And this approach also takes into the account the way that the player is perceiving and interacting with the game world, and also includes the player's resources and perception into the equation. I think that it's really helpful with this approach because it helps us to kind of think about the pre-existing knowledge that your player is bringing to the game and the assumptions that we can be blind to and not take into account because we're viewing and creating the game from the opposite side over here. And this is kind of what I mean by bias. Players are not just bringing their own perception and knowledge into a game, they are also bringing resources which are finite and differ per person. And so this also can feed into things like who is your game for, the type of game that your player, the type of player that your game is catering to. Okay, so all of this is really just to say, the player is kind of always going to be experiencing a game differently and from a different perspective than a game's designer. Schell, again, has a very nasty analogy where he talks about skin and skeleton. So he kind of says that skin is the overall player experience, the outside experience of the game, and the inner workings of a game, or the framework, is the skeleton. And as developers, we need to be aware of and be able to see skin and skeleton at once by not getting too bogged down by only thinking about the skeleton side of things. So when we're analyzing games, we're kind of inhabiting the role of the player, but trying to also understand the game and designer's intent for the game experience. Okay, so let's use Hollow Knight as an example to discuss some of these terms and thinking from the player's perspective. Okay, so if we think of the aesthetics, the game is very hard. It's very hard. I'm very bad at it. The game evokes a sense of challenge with its difficulty level, and a sense of discovery as you move through and kind of unlock different ways to access different areas. You can also think of the art style. It's got a very beautiful hand-drawn art style when we're looking at aesthetics. With dynamics, this is sort of how is it evoking a sense of challenge, right? So there's a heavy focus on challenging platforming in the game. There's dangerous enemy encounters. Other things to think about on kind of the dynamics layer are things like how certain combinations of charms in Hollow Knight can boost your character, or things like metas and preferred strategies in multiplayer games is another thing we talk about when we think about dynamics. And for mechanics, we are kind of getting to the layer that we're more used to seeing on the game development side. So remember that mechanics are kind of the rules of the game as well as the interactions and relationships of components. So Hollow Knight operates in a 2D game space. It's a platformer, so the player can hop from surface to surface. There are enemies that can hurt the player can die, the player can heal, as well as upgrade, and they can unlock more skills and abilities as they progress. Okay, so then when we look at the core mechanics of the game, really, it's quite simple. Movement and attack. Cool. Okay, so now we'll move to game balance. When we talk about game balance, we're looking at how a game balances is experienced for the player, but we're not just looking at whether a game is fair for all players. Often we can hear this term when we talk about game balance with multiplayer games with asymmetrical gameplay. it isn't really about whether a game is difficult or easy. We're thinking about the entire experience and whether the elements in a game are working together to create a fun experience. So it can be about how the game is balancing player... Hold on. What have I done? Let me take that away. Okay. It can be about how the game is balancing the player's time between moments of tension and levity. It can be about balancing risk and reward, or it can be about how the game is balancing reward and punishment. Okay. And then we can think about flow, which is a term from psychology, which can be applied to games. So if a game is too challenging, players will become frustrated. But if a game is too easy, players become bored. So over the course of playing any game, the player's skill level also increases, and games have to kind of find a way to balance challenge against skill to keep players in just the right spot to keep them playing the game. We can also think about how the game plays based on player skill. Wait, I should do this again. Okay. So this is where it can be helpful to compare notes and analysis with other players as well. Or if a game offers different difficulty levels or accessibility settings, doing multiple playthroughs at those levels to understand how the game's been balanced can be really, really helpful. And another thing we can look at is if... Okay, I'm like one click behind. Okay, another thing we can look at is if the game is offering meaningful choices. So again, thinking about the idea of like game metas, is there a dominant strategy that players are always choosing? Another example would be if you have a racing game and you offer the player the option of choosing 50 different types of cars to choose from, but mechanically the cars all operate the same way, is there a point in actually even giving them that choice if it's really not going to be affecting their gameplay? Okay, so let's think about how we can analyze this with Minecraft. It balances tension and levity with the day-night cycle. It forces players to engage with tense moments as mobs spawn in the nighttime, and it's relatively safe during the day. Enemy creatures get spawned based on brightness levels around the player. It can create tense and surprising moments when creepers sneak up on you, and if you're trying to do a low-tension activity like farming. And the player must engage with at least some of these systems as well because they need to manage health and a hunger bar. It balances risk and reward through dungeon crawling. The deeper you go mining, the higher the risk of running into zombies, spiders, creepers, skeletons. But there's also a higher chance to obtain better ore, and there's, high value items get tied to like more difficult to defeat enemies like ghast, tears, and enderpearls. It balances reward and punishment as well, with trying to incentivize players to try all the mechanics that the game has to offer. So most actions reward the player with experience, so fishing, farming, mining, breeding animals. When the player dies, they lose a portion of their experience orbs. And you could argue that the amount of experience lost is imbalanced because it's over half the amount that players have collected. So upon death, players also lose their items in their inventory, which can lead to greater player agency as well, where you have to weigh up whether it's worth it to continue spelunking at a higher risk of death and losing your items, or returning to your base first to store items for safekeeping. We can also touch on the difficulty levels in Minecraft. It has peaceful, easy, normal, hard, and hardcore difficulty settings. So this can, turn into a more specific analysis where you end up looking at a spreadsheet and seeing how each difficulty setting feels as you play, and whether each setting feels fair, but I don't have time to go into that or show you a spreadsheet. Okay, so then we can look at motivating the player. For player motivation, we kind of tend to talk about player archetypes and how each player has different motivations for playing games. So there's Barth's taxonomy where he has, a chart with killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. But I'm not really a big fan of that, so I didn't include a picture of it. I think it can really just boil down to the idea that people will play different games for the same reasons, and the same games for different reasons. Player motivation can change throughout the course of a game as well, so we can think about how we motivate and keep a player engaged and in the flow state, which is most easily seen through the use of rewards. So Shell, again, has given us a really good list of examples of rewards here. So we have things like praise, any sort of positive feedback given to players. We've got points, which can be extended to things like leaderboards. Prolonged play, so you're rewarding players with more time to play the game, which ties into the next point, which is a gateway. Which basically just means you're rewarding a player with access to new areas in a game, and you're pushing forward and motivating their sense of exploration that way. There's spectacle, which is you're just showing them something really cool. Expression, so a way for players to express themselves, which can often be seen with character customization, skins, cosmetics, or giving players access to new powers. There's also more resources, either giving them in-game currency, building materials, and a sense of status, which can be seen in competitive games with leaderboards and ranks. Okay, case study number 3. Let's do peak, because it's topical. Paige is a friend. She's not here right now, but it's fine. Not like I put this in for her or anything. For those of you who haven't played Peak, it's a multiplayer game where you and your team of scouts get stranded on an island, and in order to be rescued, you have to scale the peak. The game gets increasingly harder, and it is broken into kind of several maps and checkpoints. Every day there's a new map that is procedurally generated for players to tackle. So, firstly, players get motivated by resources that are randomly scattered throughout the map, and these resources are randomly seeded as well. Players can find food and drinks that reduce hunger and increase stamina, as well as tools to help their ascent like rope spools and chain launchers. But because the resources themselves are randomly seeded, if a player fails a run on any given day and wants to try again that same day, they will be rewarded with different items in the same locations, increasing replayability. Players also get rewarded at the end of each stage of the game with a gateway, spectacle, and prolonged play. So after reaching the top of each stage, a vista of the next level to conquer is unlocked, and the player gets a very good overview of the next level and the next stage of climbing. And they're also motivated through expression, status, and completion, with customizable options for the scouts. There's a range of cosmetics that players can choose from, and they get unlocked through play and achievements, as well as completing the game with various criteria. I think Peak does a very good job at motivating repeated play through the cosmetics, with some cosmetics being unlocked quite easily, and often accidentally, which motivates players to either look at the achievement list in Steam or in the game in order to challenge themselves and see what they can get from reaching other criteria in multiple runs. The achievements are also tied strongly with the theming of the game, so you are a little scout, and the achievements will show up as actual physical badges that you're wearing on your sash, which encourages players to get more badges. Okay, and the last section I want to touch on is how games guide the player. We can look at things like affordances, which is how a game affords options to the player, and signifiers, which show a player what they can interact with. So affordances is a term from more general design theory, where when you talk about an item having affordances, you're talking about the item or object having strong cues for a player to what can be interacted with and how that object is going to function. So my example here from Left 4 Dead 2, I'd say that doors and ladders are some of the easiest to understand objects with great affordances. If you're in a game and you're in a room with a closed door at the very start, it's quite clear that the door should be used to exit the room. But doors can also be really tricky because it's 50-50 whether if a door says push on it, it's actually going to open when you push the door, even when it has signifiers. I think Left 4 Dead 2 does a really good job with their safe room doors. So the design of it makes it very clear it's the start and end point of each level. It's bright red, draws your attention. And the window serves as a gateway as well, which shows the players that there's more behind and beyond the door. A lot of the time, especially with games approaching visual realism, it can be kind of trickier. Sorry, can we scroll on my notes? Thank you. It can be hard for players to know kind of definitively what is interactable, right? Which is where signifiers come along. So I think the most commonly known and debated use of signifiers is the evil yellow paint. So here we have a very beautiful yellow ladder from Resident Evil 4. I can rant about yellow paint ad nauseum, okay? So we're not going to go into it now. But it's usually there for a reason, and the reason is that gamers are stupid, so. Also, quick Nick Cage break, because I forgot that I modded Left 4 Dead, so when I went to take a screenshot of the door, I scared myself. Yeah. I'm going to break for water. Okay, so with affordances and signifiers, it also doesn't necessarily need to be object-related. If we look at a game like Super Mario again, the affordance of the large negative space to the left of the screen and the more busy area to the right shows us where we need to go when we're playing the game, as well as the initial positioning of Mario. He's facing towards the right, so this kind of automatically tells us there is something over here. When they remade the game, though, you can kind of see there's this addition of a signifier arrow, but this isn't really adding much to show players the possibility of where to go. It was already quite clear here. And you know, with this, I feel like the castle and the flowers in the background being quite high contrast and similar to Mario, it kind of makes it noisier, and I think they kind of made it worse, but we won't get into that. So also in addition to this, we can look at mapping and feedback. So mapping is how we define the way that a player interacts with controls to navigate through the game space. You might think that it's very basic and not something that you have to think about, but I think sticking to the way that you've mapped controls can be very, very important. I've been playing a lot of Abiotic Factor with friends, and usually E is used as kind of the main interaction control, but interactions get really complex in Abiotic Factor. You can hit E, you can also sometimes hold E, you can also use F as another interact button, and then you can also hold F. And if you play a wide variety of games, it can also get more confusing because E and F are used commonly as the main interaction key, and muscle memory can sometimes really mess with you, where, you know, F is usually the main interaction key for games like Dishonored, but a lot of other games use E, stuff like that. We can also look at feedback, so how a game reacts to player input. This is how a game communicates to the player that they've done the right or the wrong thing. Effective feedback is often immediate, informative, and interpretable for the player. So I'm not saying it's a great example, but Heavy Rain gives you very immediate and recognizable feedback when you press X to Sean. Okay, so now we'll apply this to the start of Half-Life 2. We're going to just be analyzing kind of how Half-Life guides the player. If we think about the context of this game, it's an early first-person shooter game with a seamless tutorial. I think it's important to think about when this game came out and how it kind of pioneered a lot of what we see in games today. It was also my second first-person shooter experience that I ever played, so Portal was my first. So I hold it very, very dear to my heart, which is why G-Man is the thumb of my talk. But yeah, when you're playing through Half-Life, immediately the game gives you mapping information. So the controls will pop up on the side if you don't move at all. Then we get another control that gets added to our mapping, E, to interact. And this will pop up as you are entering City 17 for the first time and you see this woman, and this mapping will remain consistent throughout the game for the player to use as the interaction key. Later on in the intro, Barney tells you to make a getaway by piling things up and getting through a window. And here we learn about the affordance of climbing ladders. So again, ladders are a very big one in a game. Just by having a ladder in your scene, players will assume that you can use a ladder because it's such a strongly afforded and designed object. And then here we see another mapping of E. This time we're getting told that E is to pick up an object, and there's lots of crates around you. So in order to leave the area, you need to pile up boxes. And I've also learned that if you throw all the boxes out the window for some reason, because you decide to be an idiot or a smartass, a box will spawn behind you, so you cannot get gated and stuck in this area. We also learn in this section to jump with spacebar, and we're also taught the physics interactions in the game. There are objects earlier on that you can interact with as a player that, you know, show off some of the physics systems, but here the player is unavoidably guided to interact with the physics in the game. And then again, using E for interaction control is emphasized once more with the Combine. So, I hate this guy. He will not move or let you through until you pick up the can that he pushes onto the floor. What does it teach us as a player? It shows us, as players, that we can interact with loose items in the world, like speaking to characters. We can pick up large items like crates, and we can pick up small items that might seem less significant, like cans. And it also shows us sometimes that content in the game can be gated until we complete the interaction being asked of us, and that the function for interaction will be the same for all of these actions. Okay, but then the game does something a little cheeky, and it subverts the Combine's instruction. And it shows us something else. We don't have to obey the Combine. While you're holding the can, the player will get a pop-up teaching them that they can throw the can. directly contradicting what he's telling us to do, which is put the can in the bin. So it also suggests to us that we can throw the can at the Combine. And I think what I love about this and what we can learn from this, and I think why I really love how Half-Life 2 has been designed, is that it ties into the narrative and the theme of the game as well. You play as Gordon Freeman, and you're here to disrupt the order and control of the Combine in City 17 and become the face of the rebellion. Okay, so you can choose to listen, or you can throw the can at the Combine, which is what I did, and then he chased me and I screamed a lot. By complying, he will move aside. By throwing the can, he will hit you, but then he will move aside and let you continue through the game. In this interaction, we are still rewarding the player and we're still supporting their intentionality of their actions. They're getting immediate feedback of the Combine attacking them or moving away. Okay, is everyone still with me? I hope that everything is still making sense. This is how I felt in class, talking and teaching the students about guiding a player using Half-Life 2, and I was just met with the Gen Z stare, because the game is 20 years old. It's 20 years old, which is older than a bunch of the students that I was teaching at the time. Okay, so hopefully now, when your coworker comes into work raving about a mechanic in a different game, and how you should definitely be adding this to the game you're creating, or if you're that coworker, putting your coworkers in that awkward position, you can stop and think about the mechanic. What is the purpose of this mechanic? Why is that in Last of Us Part 2? Okay, so let's do another analysis. It balances tension in the game by giving players a break between high stress and high tension moments of combat, and a break from cinematics by giving players something to interact with that's low stress and low tension. It rewards the player with spectacle by getting players to slow down and go, oh hey, this is really impressive, and also to appreciate the environment and the aesthetics of the game as they're trying to solve the puzzle. As they're doing so, players are also guided where to go next in the game. This can also lead into the aesthetics of the game, which has an emphasis on exploration as Ellie is moving through unknown locations. It also rewards players with a gateway and progression, as resources and certain sections of the game are gated for the player until they solve some of these rope puzzles. Also kind of loosely related to this is that it rewards players with more of the narrative of the game, more narrative moments through character conversations between Ellie and Dina, as well as emphasizing the traits of Ellie, like her resourcefulness and her physical strength and her survival instincts. But also, maybe the last one is that they just really wanted to show off the sick rope tech. Here we can see from a design perspective that Naughty Dog has used ropes in a few different puzzle situations where the rope is an electrical cable you need to plug in, and it's also a physical rope that you need to use to access hard-to-reach areas in the game. Also, this puzzle sucked. I could not figure it out. I had to watch so many YouTube videos of where do I put the rope. Okay, so now what? How can we actually apply what we learn from critical gameplay analysis to our own games? Hopefully, through this process of breaking down mechanics and systems and the ways that other games implement these things, you're now better able to see that it's not as simple as saying, well, this game does X, so we should also put X in our game. From the many case studies I've presented, we can see that critical gameplay analysis gives us an insight into the amount of work that is put into the thinking and design for some really impressive and successful games. It really isn't as simple as just throwing in a new mechanic. You can see how these games have effectively and holistically designed and implemented mechanics to create a better experience for players. There's intention and there's clarity in the way that they've melded mechanics and systems together. The main point I'm really trying to make here is we need to think harder about the features and systems in games, and how it's very easy to have an idea, but it's a lot more involved to implement said idea. So really, let's just take a second and just have a before saying that we want to implement something new to our project. Okay, so hopefully you're feeling more equipped now with some more terminology and ways of thinking about games. He's supposed to not be here, so just pretend he's not there yet. So in conclusion, critical gameplay analysis helps us to break down the formal elements of a game, so we can ask questions like, what do you do in the game? What are the core mechanics? We can think about how those elements interact and what experience emerges from those interactions when playing a game. We can think about whether the gameplay feels fair or whether it feels balanced, and how the game has been designed to achieve that balance. We can think about how the player is being rewarded throughout the game. And we can ask, does the game effectively guide and teach the player? This is by no means a comprehensive list of things that you can ask yourself when analyzing games. Like, I haven't even touched on anything to do with narrative, really. But hopefully this awakens a spark in you to carry out your own critical gameplay analysis. And I'm also very sorry if this has ruined the experience of playing games, because you have now had your third eye awakened and become aware of the skeleton that lives inside the games that you play. Cool. That's all. Also, these are my cats, cat tax. Moose is taking a dump in this picture. Just so that you're all aware, he is shitting right now. Cool. Yeah. Cool. So I think I do have time for questions. How much time do I have? Yeah? Sick. Okay, so there is a microphone. I will not be able to hear you if you yell, so put your hand up if you have a question, and then our lovely volunteer will come bring a microphone to you. Yeah? No? No questions? I do a really good job? No questions? Oh, yeah.
Hello, hello. Is it okay? All right. So, let's see how I can phrase it in a question. Because it's, I would say, across disciplines and across experiences, even with people that are making a thing, so even the people that will make a game, it's very easy to focus, whenever you have a feedback, it's very easy to focus on the higher visibility part of your experience. So whenever you get told by a teammate, we should include rope tech, reminds me of when you get player feedback or when you get tester feedback. Unless you've been doing it for a long time and you've been doing it professionally, it's very easy to focus on the most visible part of your experience. So as much as I love the talk from the point of view of a designer analyzing the game, I'm also thinking you can flip or how can we flip the things to actually try to understand the intentionality of the people giving feedback, because they clearly have something in their mind, but the way they're expressing is usually with the let's implement this, which clearly is like, okay, we need to figure out what they're thinking behind it. So what is your experience by working and trying to just have a process to how can I get to the core what someone is thinking when they're telling me this, so I can actually maybe address that useful idea?
Yeah, so I think that can get really tricky, because when we think about the way that we make games, we, like you were saying, we kind of focus on it from the design perspective, the game designer's perspective. So if we think back to TC's her sort of, what is it called, diagram, she, with that framework, she's actually positing a player-focused perspective to think about and look at games. And so I think that with that, you kind of need to think about what your intentions are of the game, but also the context and the surrounding things with it. And when you're taking in feedback from players, trying to think about where they're coming from in terms of their previous experience, the types of games that they like to play. And I think that can help bring that feedback into context, and then help you see, like, okay, so they're saying that in this game they don't actually like that we've added combat to it, for example. Why is that? Is it because we are selling the game as a puzzle adventure game and there's combat in it for some reason, and that's turning people off, or it's causing friction there? Is there something that we should have thought about more holistically when we were designing the game? And I think with that as well, what really helps, and something that we do at Space Rock, which I love our game director Josh, he's amazing, is that he will write out and plan a beautiful design macro for us. And the way that he writes it is he'll break down like the mechanic or what he would like for the game, as well as his intention as the designer for what he is expecting players to feel. So he's also thinking about the aesthetic result of it, which I think is a really good way to get started as well. And hopefully it means that the player experience is aligning better with what you are hoping to design. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And a quick admin thing. Do you remember the last model that you showed, the one that was one of your coworkers? Is that, because I didn't see a reference, is that available in a publication?
Yes, it is available. Oh, actually,
Maybe I missed it. I'm sorry.
I have
there we go.
references.
There you go.
Yay! We love references. So I can also put these slides up online.
That'd be great.
I'm kind of planning to be a bit sneaky and ask NZGDC if I can like put my talk up for free somewhere and then have the slides included, because I think everyone should know this stuff. So yes, so her one's the one right at the top here. And if you just search for her name here and then Compassionate Game Design, it's free. It's up on ResearchGate.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
Hello. The question I had was, do you think the yellow paint epidemic that they talk about, do you
Okay.
think that was done fractionally? Like they had a ladder and then they put a little bit of yellow paint on it and the players still didn't notice, and then they added a bit more and then they fractionally got up to like, oh crap, we have to paint the entire thing yellow for people to notice?
Yes.
Or do you think companies were like, okay, let's just go maximal yellow paint from now on because that seems to be what works?
I have a feeling that it's something that will always show through playtesting. And then when you see one game doing it, you'll just also do it. And like, I feel like as well, I've worked on projects where we try the approach of not using yellow paint or not having things signified as vividly as yellow paint, and then watching people play the game and then them getting frustrated because they're like, I didn't know I could interact with that. So you're like, God damn it, I'm gonna have to cover this whole fucking game in yellow paint. This is ridiculous. So yeah. But yeah, I think fundamentally, like, gamers, like, they like to complain about yellow paint. They're like, this game is like really realistic, so I just don't understand why there would be yellow paint everywhere. But if you take the yellow paint away, they don't know what to do because they don't use their brains. So yeah.
I find in a lot of like conversations that the words like mechanics and systems are often used interchangeably, and clearly they're like distinct things in game design. So how do you think this is kind of a problem with how we talk about games? And like how should we address it if it is?
Yeah, I think it like I said, it's like it's kind of tricky because defining what a mechanic is like a little bit nebulous, but I think when you try to break things down into core mechanics, you can see the way that a core mechanic or mechanics will work to create a system, which is that dynamic layer. But then that also gets tricky because when you talk about the dynamic layer, you're looking at also the kind of things that emerge from players interacting with the systems and then accounting for that or not accounting for that and designing for that or not designing for that. So yeah, it's a really hard one, but I think that you become better at your job and you become a better developer by being able to understand what is a mechanic and what is a system and what mechanics make up parts of the system. Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions? No? Okay. Cool. Thanks, everyone.